I'll call to order the special board meeting for the budget hearing.
I'd like to make a motion to approve the agenda.
I was pausing. I was waiting for a roll call vote, but we don't have it on.
We don't have.
So that's fine this time. Okay, there's a motion to approve the agenda. Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right, the agenda approval is moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the agenda is approved. And now we have presentation of the proposed 2018-19 budget. And this is by our director, our executive director of finance, Mr. Tome. Mr. Tome, could I, okay, Mr. Bonds is getting this fixed. I want to make sure that people at home can see this presentation before you continue. All right, thank you.
Okay, we're good? Okay. So the biggest piece of the budget starting off is the revenue limit, and that is what tells you how much money you're going to be allowed to raise between state aid and property tax. And that is based on your membership, which is how many students reside in the Beloit School District. Then you receive $1 per pupil amount, and then you can have exemptions, and the total becomes your revenue limit authority. So for this year, it works on a 3-year average. Our 3-year average is 7,131 students. You multiply it by the per pupil amount, you get the 69.8 million. That would be your regular revenue limit. Then below that line are the exemptions that we have. And the big one this year is the hold harmless declining enrollment. Enrollment was a lot lower than we expected, but the state takes that into account, and they actually give you an exemption to help cushion you on the way down. As you're losing students, they don't take all that revenue away from you right away. They let you recapture some of it. So in our case, we could recapture 2.2 million due to the declining enrollment. Then we also have the energy exemption projects, which is all the remodeling in the district this year, which was 5.8 million, which was added on to the revenue limit. Private school students going out to voucher schools from Beloit was 907,000. Then you have transfer of service, which is special ed kids coming in, and a few adjustments from last year, and you get to your total of $77.9 million. Would be our total revenue from taxes and state aid. So just a look at what has happened to the membership in the district. You can see in the past from 09, 10, moving up, it was starting to gradually head up, and now it started back down again, and this year it's taken a significant drop. So those are things that affect your revenue limit. As your enrollment declines, that limit's going to start declining along with it. And then the other big piece of the puzzle is the state equalization aid. And for this year, it's actually up $2.5 million, mainly due to you did energy exemption projects last year. And in the case of Beloit, the more money you spend, the more state aid you get the next year. So it lags 1 year behind, but you get more aid as you spend more money because we are a highly aided district. And it's based on your equalized property value per student. And so that is, the state looks at that and they figure out state districts that have low equalized value per student, they believe should get more state aid. So in the case of Beloit, we have pretty low value per student, we get a lot of state aid. Across the state, this year actually our equalized value went up a little bit more than the state average. So next year, it may actually decrease our state aid, but the formula is pretty complicated. It's based on what happens in all the other school districts in the state, so you kind of have to wait and see how it all shakes out. And then it is also based on your membership, which again was a pretty big decline. Last year it declined 34 students. This coming year it's a pretty severe decline, so we'll kind of have to wait and see what that does to the total state aid next year. So the way it works, you take your revenue limit authority, you subtract your equalization aid and your high poverty aid and a few other aids, and you end up with the amount you're allowed to levy. In this case, this year we would be at $12,528,000 for the general fund tax levy if we levied to the maximum amount allowed by the state. So what does that do? The actual all funds tax levy, which would be the general fund that we just talked about, plus you have debt service for all of the buildings, the bonds you've issued over the years, the total levy would be $18,125,000, which would produce a mill rate of $12.42 per thousand and an $87 increase on a $100,000 house. You can see last year the mill rate was $11.54 and taxes went up $181 on that $100,000 house. But the year before that, taxes actually went down $183 on that same house, mainly due to state aid going up and down. So as state aid moves, your levy moves up and down. Big thing to remember on your levy, in 16-17, you levied $1.6 million for the energy exemption projects. 17-18, it doubled. You did $3.2 million of projects. And now this year it's at $5.8 million. And as that number goes straight on your revenue limit authority, goes straight towards the tax levy. So when you see the tax levy go up, the vast majority is due to these revenue limit projects, or revenue limit energy exemption projects. So where do we get revenue in the district? So this just gives you a breakdown of the big chunks. Tax levy obviously is a big piece. Then general aid from the state is a huge chunk. Then you get some other aid from the state, would be like your handicapped aid and your transportation aid and those things. And then your federal sources would be all the federal grants that the district gets. And then there's a miscellaneous revenue at the end, and you come up to a total of $92 million in the general fund and a little under $15 million for special education. And the way that looks on a chart then, as you can see, you're getting the vast majority of your money is coming from the state, and then your next biggest piece is going to come from the local taxpayers, and then the federal aid takes up the bulk of it, and then there's a few miscellaneous things from there. So in the case of Beloit, very highly state aided, so no surprise that's where most of the money comes from. And then special education works a little differently. Their biggest piece of the pie is the money that they get transferred from the general fund. So they have a huge transfer amount. That money we've already been state aided on, so they don't aid you on it twice. You just send the money over to the special education fund. But then there also is 20% coming from state grants, and then federal grants is a bigger piece of special ed, so they get more federal money in the special ed area. And then you go to the expense side, and as would be expected in a school, the majority of your money is spent on salaries and benefits because we are a service organization and that's what we do. Thing to remember here is the purchase services you see is $23 million, but in the case here, that's because we are contracting out for technology services, custodial services, and transportation, which in other districts, those would all be salaries and benefits you'd be paying to your employees, but instead we're buying those services from somebody else. So you can see that that makes up the bulk of your budget. Then you have the other things, you know, supplies, a little bit of equipment, some leases on the computers, you buy insurance for the district, and a few things here and there, and you come up to your $92 million for the general fund again. And the way that looks on a chart then, as you can see, salaries and benefits are your two biggest chunks, along with purchase services, and then the slices that are left is everything else. So in a school, salaries and benefits are the biggest driver of everything. So then we have our fund balance, which is Over the lifetime of the district, this is our revenues have exceeded expenses, and we have this money set aside. It doesn't mean you actually have that money on any particular day. If you went to the bank, you wouldn't find that amount in your bank account, but that is what you have for revenues exceeding expenses. And where that becomes important is during the year, you get your state aid at different times, and you get your tax money at different times, but you have to keep making your payrolls every 2 weeks. So there are times of the year when we have almost no money left in the bank, and then there will be times of the year where we might have $30 million in the bank. But if you don't have a fund balance, you aren't able to coast through those times when you're waiting for state aid, and then you have to borrow money, and then you have to pay interest on that money. So by having a fund balance, you've been able to avoid paying interest and having an interest expense in the district. I believe the goal was to have a 20% fund balance, and you can see in 16-17 you reached that number, and we are still at that number for last year, and projected if we did everything proposed in the budget, we would still be over 20% for a fund balance at the end of this year. So then the question came up again today, what if we levy to the max, and then what if we don't? So last year, the levy was $16 million. Again, the mill rate was the $11.54, and that was a $181 increase on a $100,000 house from last year. So this year, there are certainly options that you could explore. We would recommend that you levy the full $18,125,000. Yes, it's a bitter pill for people to swallow, but taxes go up $87 on a $100,000 house. The reason we would recommend that is that if you don't levy to the maximum, that authority to levy that money goes away next year. So if you changed your mind later and said, I'd like to recapture that money we didn't levy, you can't do that. The state says you had your chance. You can't go back and get it later if you change your mind. So that being said, one option would be to under levy by $1 million. And if you did that, your mill rate would go to $11.73, which would be an increase of $19 on a $100,000 house. And then as you can see, you could under levy by $500,000, and you go to $12.07, or increase of $53 on a $100,000 house. Or you could go all the way down and say, nope, we're going to freeze the levy where it was last year. And if you did that, you would have a mill rate of $10.98, and the $100,000 house would see a decrease of $56 on their tax bill. So those are kind of the options that are out there. So I guess with that, I can just take questions and we'll go from there.
Could you please tell us, I mean, you explained it to a couple of us earlier, but could you tell us what effect it would have on the actual budget if we were to take one of these other options? Like, where would this money come from if we said we're going to reduce it by $1 million or reduce it by $500,000?
We would get back together with the administrative team, and we would look for areas where maybe the budget is, we budgeted extra money because of contingencies or something like that. We would take the money out of those areas or anywhere else we could find the savings. Or we could simply just run with it. You would have an unbalanced budget, and at the end of the year, hopefully things would work our way. You know, bus fuel was cheaper, or it didn't cost as much to heat the buildings, or all the other things that could happen during the year, and you still would end up with a balanced budget in that case. You're going to attempt.
There's no way to do it.
Okay.
Say, Bob, so when you talked about if we don't tax to the max now, we can't change our mind. So I'm assuming you mean we can't change our mind within the school year, but next year that number changes anyway, correct?
Well, next year you would, because you didn't levy to the maximum, that becomes the new base to build next year off of. So if you levied less money this year, that becomes the new base next year. So you couldn't say, say next year the revenue limit was going to go up $1 million and you had under levied by $1 million. You can't say, I want to raise it by the full $2 million. You can't. The first $1 million that you under levied is already lost.
So would we not be in that position then every year? So you're based on that, you'd have to say you have to tax to the max every year for possibly losing money. So when would that end?
Well, it's probably going to turn on you because of the enrollment. Your limit is based on the number of students. So as you decrease your enrollment, that revenue limit is going to get smaller. So, if it's 77 million this year, it might be 75, and then it's going to drop to 70, and it's going to slowly work its way down as you have less students.
Okay, thank you.
Can you tell us about one place you said you might have cushioned the budget a bit was in the health insurance area? Can you explain that to the rest of the board? I feel like, I'd like them to have the same information we had earlier.
Well, the history over the years has been that we have an actuary who tells us what we should use as a health insurance rate to charge employees and for the district to pay as well. Over the past few years, the claims have been less than what we have charged in those rates, so we have had good years. We've had good claim years, and you could certainly say we expect that to continue next year, and in that case you would just budget less money for health insurance and hope that your claims come in fine and you would be okay.
Did you have a question?
With the declining enrollment that we've had due to open enrollment, and knowing that we have a buffer because we have the 3-year rolling, do we have any idea or any projection